I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened that night in Graywood, Texas. I spent 17 years building things with my hands, pouring concrete foundations that would outlast my grandchildren, and I thought my marriage was built on the same kind of solid ground. I was wrong about that last part, and the way I found out would have broken most men. But here is the thing about discovering that your entire life is a carefully constructed lie. It either destroys you or it turns you into something far more dangerous than you ever knew you could be. The heat that evening was brutal, the kind of Texas summer that makes the asphalt soft under your boots and forces even the cicadas to shut up and conserve their energy. I had been running a crew on a commercial build downtown, a new office complex that was eating up my days and most of my patience. And the humidity had been so thick all afternoon that my shirt was soaked through by 10 in the morning and never really dried out. We were behind schedule because the city inspector had found some issues with the electrical rough-in, which meant I had spent most of my lunch hour on the phone with the subcontractor, trying to explain in very simple terms why his guys needed to actually read the blueprints instead of just winging it. By the time I climbed into my truck at the end of the day, my back was aching, my hands were raw from the work gloves, and all I wanted was a cold shower and maybe a beer on the porch. But the concrete delivery got pushed to the next morning because the plant had some kind of equipment failure, which meant there was no reason to stay at the site, and I found myself pulling into my driveway at 4:30 instead of my usual 7. The house looked the same as it always did, the same brick facade with the same manicured lawn that Laura insisted we pay a service to maintain because she said it reflected on our standing in the community. I never understood what standing she was talking about. I built things for a living, and the people who hired me did not care about my grass. They cared about whether I delivered quality work on time and on budget. But Laura had opinions about everything, and somewhere along the way I had stopped arguing and started just nodding along because it was easier than having the same conversation for the 100th time. The house greeted me with air conditioning cold enough to make me shiver after the brutal heat outside, and that transition from furnace to freezer always made me feel slightly disoriented, like stepping through a portal into a different world. I called out her name as I kicked off my work boots in the mudroom, the ones caked with dust and dried cement, and the particular grime that accumulates when you spend your days on construction sites. But all I got back was the hum of the central air and a silence that felt wrong in a way I could not immediately identify. It was like walking into a room where the furniture has been moved just slightly off from where you remember it. Everything technically in place, but the proportions somehow different. The shadows falling at angles that your brain registers as incorrect even before your conscious mind catches up. The kitchen was empty, the granite countertops gleaming in the afternoon light that came through the windows above the sink. And the living room was empty too, the big leather couch and the television that Laura had insisted we needed, even though we barely watched it together anymore. I found myself climbing the stairs with a growing sense of something I did not want to name yet. My sock feet silent on the carpet runner that Laura had picked out 3 years ago, because she said it made the place feel more refined and sophisticated. Like we were the kind of people who cared about interior design instead of the kind of people who had been married for 15 years and barely remembered to replace the soap in the bathroom. Our bedroom door was open, and I stopped in the doorway because what I saw there knocked the breath clean out of my lungs and made my heart do something complicated in my chest that felt like it was simultaneously speeding up and stopping altogether. Laura stood in front of the full-length mirror, the one that she had bought at an antique store in Austin and had shipped to the house at considerable expense because she said it had good light. And she was wearing a dress that I had never seen before in my life. It was the color of skin, a kind of peachy nude that looked almost invisible from certain angles. And the fabric was so thin that I could see every single curve and line of her body through it with a clarity that left absolutely nothing to the imagination. She was not wearing anything underneath, not a bra, not underwear, nothing at all, and the dress clung to her like it had been painted on by someone with very specific intentions about what the viewer should see and feel. Her makeup was done the way she used to do it when we were dating, back when she still tried to impress me. The smoky eyes and the red lips that she had stopped bothering with somewhere around year 5 of our marriage when she decided that I was not worth the effort anymore. Her hair was curled in loose waves that bounced when she tilted her head to examine her reflection, and she was adjusting her earrings with the kind of careful attention to detail that suggested she was preparing for something important. She was getting ready for something. That much was obvious, and every instinct I had honed from 20 years of reading people and situations told me that she was not getting ready for me. This was not a dress you put on to surprise your husband when he comes home from work tired and dirty. This was a hunting dress. This was a dress designed to attract attention, to draw eyes, to make men forget their manners and their wedding vows. And my wife was putting it on in our bedroom, in the middle of the afternoon, while I was supposed to be at work for another 3 hours. She noticed me in the mirror, our eyes meeting in that reflected space like two strangers recognizing each other across a crowded room, and I watched her face go through about 6 different expressions in the span of 2 seconds before it settled into something hard and cold, like a door slamming shut behind glass. She did not startle, did not jump or gasp, or do any of the things that a person might do if they were caught doing something they should not be doing. She just looked at me with this flat expression that made me feel like a stranger who had wandered into the wrong house, an intruder who had no right to be there witnessing her preparations. "You are home early," she said, and her voice was perfectly calm, perfectly controlled, like she was commenting on the weather or the price of gas. "The concrete delivery got pushed," I said, and I could hear how my voice sounded rough and strange, sandpaper on raw wood. "Where are you going dressed like that?" Laura turned around to face me directly, and up close the dress was even more revealing than I had thought. The fabric stretched tight across her chest and hips, outlining every detail of her body in a way that would make any man's mouth go dry, and I could see that she had been working out, that she had been taking care of herself in ways that she had stopped doing for me years ago. She crossed her arms under her breasts, which had the effect of pushing them up even higher against the sheer fabric, and she looked at me like I was something mildly inconvenient that she had to deal with before she could get on with her evening. Quote 3. She said, and her voice was steady and calm and completely without warmth. Quote 4. She paused and something flickered across her face that might have been contempt or might have been amusement at some private joke I was not in on. Quote 5. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire, and I felt something shift inside my chest, a physical sensation like a lock clicking into place or maybe breaking apart entirely. Here was my wife of 15 years, the woman I had supported through her failed attempt at starting a boutique, and her expensive hobby of collecting art that we could not afford, and her constant need for validation that I could never quite seem to provide, standing in our bedroom in a dress designed to seduce other men and telling me flat out that she was going to spend her evening with someone else. She was not even pretending anymore. Not bothering with the lies about late meetings and girls' nights and conferences that required overnight stays. She was looking me in the eye and telling me the truth, or at least part of it, because she had decided that I was too weak or too stupid to do anything about it. I waited for the anger to come, the screaming fury that I knew was supposed to accompany this kind of betrayal, the hot rush of rage that makes men throw punches and break furniture and generally make complete idiots of themselves. But instead I felt something strange and cold settle over me, like frost forming on the inside of a window on a winter morning. My emotions seemed to step back behind a glass wall, present but unreachable, and I found myself looking at this situation the way I would look at a structural problem on a job site, assessing damage, calculating costs, planning next steps. The building was compromised, the foundation had cracked, and now the question was not how to save it, but how to tear it down safely without getting anyone killed in the process. "Well," I said, and my voice came out flat and even, completely devoid of the emotion she was probably expecting. "I hope you have a good time." That threw her, I could tell. She had been prepared for a fight, had probably rehearsed her lines and her excuses and her deflections, and my calm acceptance had knocked her off balance. She blinked at me, her carefully made-up eyes narrowing with suspicion, and for a moment I thought she might push, might try to provoke the reaction she wanted, but Laura had never been one to look a gift horse in the mouth. She shrugged, a gesture that made the dress shift on her shoulders in a way that was probably calculated to be distracting, and she walked past me through the doorway without another word. close enough that I caught the scent of the perfume I had given her for Christmas, the expensive French one that she had said she was saving for special occasions, close enough that I could feel the heat of her body through the sheer fabric of that obscene dress. I heard her heels clicking on the stairs, heard the garage door open, heard her car start with a purr that reminded me I had paid for that car just 6 months ago when she decided she needed something nicer than her old sedan. The mechanical rumble of the garage door closing was the last sound I heard before the house went silent again, and then I was alone in a bedroom that still smelled faintly of her perfume, surrounded by her things, standing in the middle of a life that had just revealed itself to be nothing but a stage set constructed from lies. Most men in Texas would have grabbed the keys to their truck and followed her, would have made a scene in some parking lot, would have shouted and threatened and maybe thrown a punch at whoever she was meeting. Most men would have reached for the bourbon bottle that I kept in the study and drowned themselves in it, would have called their buddies and cried into the phone about how their wife was cheating on them, would have done something loud and dramatic and ultimately pointless that would have made them feel better for about 5 minutes before making everything infinitely worse. That is what emotion does. It makes you feel like you are doing something when really you are just flailing around and making noise. But I am not most men, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice that sounded a lot like my father was reminding me of the lesson he had taught me when I was 14 years old and had gotten into a fight with a kid twice my size who had been talking trash about my family. You do not swing a hammer at a problem that requires a screwdriver, my father had told me while he was driving me home from the principal's office. Quote, I had gotten suspended for 3 days for that fight, and the other kid had gotten away with nothing because his parents had money and mine did not. And I had learned a lesson about power and patience that had served me well in every negotiation and conflict since. Emotion is useful for getting through the day, for connecting with people and experiencing joy and all the other things that make life worth living. But when you need to actually fix something that has gone badly wrong, emotion will only make you sloppy. It will make you predictable. And I was not about to give Laura the satisfaction of being predictable. I went downstairs to the living room, moving with a calmness that surprised even me, and I found Laura's tablet sitting on the charger where she always left it, tucked into the little alcove between the couch and the end table. She was careless with it because she did not think she had anything to hide, or maybe she just did not think I was smart enough to look. The password screen came up, a simple 4-digit code, and I typed in the numbers of our wedding anniversary, June 15th, 0615, and the tablet unlocked like it was happy to see me. The irony of that was not lost on me, that she was so confident in my obliviousness, so certain that I was just the dumb contractor who came home dirty and tired and never noticed anything happening right under his nose, that she had not even bothered to change her password. I opened her messages and I started reading. And by the time I finished, I understood exactly what I was dealing with and exactly what I needed to do about it. There were 2 of them, 2 men who had been occupying space in my wife's bed and in her life while I was out building shopping centers and medical offices and putting roofs over people's heads. The first was David Clark, a real estate agent who specialized in high-end properties and who I had actually met at a few business functions over the years. He was the kind of guy who always seemed to be working an angle, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes and a handshake that felt like he was measuring you for a coffin every time he gripped your palm. His suits were always perfectly tailored, his hair always perfectly styled, and there was something about the way he looked at people that made you feel like he was calculating your net worth before he decided whether you were worth his time. I had never liked him, but I had written it off as simple personality clash. Some people just rub you the wrong way, and that does not mean they are actually bad people. The second was Brian Miller, an IT consultant who had done some work for the city government a few years back, and who I remembered as a nervous, twitchy guy who could not seem to make eye contact for more than half a second at a time. He was the opposite of David in almost every way. Awkward where David was smooth, uncertain where David was confident, the kind of man who seemed perpetually surprised that anyone was paying attention to him at all. I had barely noticed him at the events where we had crossed paths, and I certainly had not imagined that he was the kind of guy who would be sleeping with another man's wife. They were different types entirely, and it took me a minute to understand what they had in common until I realized that the answer was simple. They were both married, They were both desperate for something they were not getting at home, and they had both fallen for my wife's particular brand of manipulation. Laura had always been good at making men feel special, at making them believe that they were the only person in the room who truly understood her. And she had clearly been running that game on both of them simultaneously without either one catching on. The messages went back months, hundreds of conversations spread across two different threads, and as I read through them, I felt that cold clarity deepen and harden inside me like concrete setting in a form. They talked about me constantly, these three conspirators, and their contempt was breathtaking in its casual cruelty. David called me the builder like it was some kind of insult, like spending your life creating things with your hands was something to be ashamed of. And he joked about how I probably counted on my fingers and thought a wine list was a shopping guide for the discount section at Walmart. He talked about how Laura deserved better than a man who came home smelling like sawdust and sweat, how she was wasted on someone who did not appreciate her intelligence and sophistication. Brian was worse in some ways, more vicious in his observations, even though he was supposedly the timid one of the group. He speculated about what Laura must have to do to keep me satisfied, making crude comments about construction workers and their limited intellectual capacities, suggesting that she probably had to dumb herself down just to have a conversation with me. He seemed to take particular pleasure in imagining my stupidity, maybe because it made him feel better about sneaking around behind my back, like he was doing Laura a favor by providing her with the mental stimulation that her idiot husband could not offer. And Laura, my wife of 15 years, the woman I had supported through her failed business ventures and her expensive hobbies and her constant need for validation that I could never quite seem to provide no matter how hard I tried, laughed along with all of it. She added her own observations, called me predictable and boring and rough and unsophisticated, complained about how I never wanted to go to the parties she thought were important, how I was more interested in my work than in her needs, how I had turned into the kind of man she had sworn she would never end up with when she was younger and still had dreams of something more exciting. But the part that really caught my attention, the part that made me sit back in my chair and actually smile for the first time since I had seen that dress, was the discussion about money. They were planning something, the three of them, a scheme that had apparently been developing for several months and was getting close to execution. The plan involved Laura divorcing me, filing papers that would paint her as the victim of a cold and neglectful husband, with David helping her hide assets and transfer money into accounts that I would not be able to touch. Brian was apparently providing some kind of technical expertise that I did not fully understand, something about digital trails and offshore transactions and making sure that poor Michael never figured out where his money had gone until it was far too late to do anything about it. There were references to a trip to Cancun, the three of them fantasizing about lying on the beach and drinking cocktails paid for with my hard-earned savings. There were discussions about timing, about when to file the papers to maximize the financial damage, about how to make sure that the judge saw Laura as the sympathetic party who had been trapped in an unhappy marriage with a workaholic who never gave her the attention she deserved. They were not just cheating on me. They were planning to rob me blind and laugh about it while they did. Three snakes in a pit congratulating each other on how clever they were. I set the tablet down on the coffee table, and I sat there in the dark living room for maybe an hour, just thinking. The anger was there, deep underneath the ice. But it was not the uncontrolled rage that makes men do stupid things. It was something else, something patient and purposeful, and it felt like a tool in my hand rather than a fire in my chest. I thought about my options, laid them out like blueprints on a table, examined each one for structural weaknesses and potential failure points. I could confront Laura, have the screaming match she was probably expecting, let the whole thing blow up in a spectacular mess of accusations and counter-accusations. But that would give her time to prepare, to get her story straight, to move the money before I could do anything to protect it. I could hire a divorce attorney tomorrow morning, file papers before she did, and try to get ahead of whatever scheme they had cooked up. But that would alert all three of them that I knew something, would send them scurrying like rats when the lights come on, and I would lose the advantage of surprise. Or I could do something else entirely. I could take my time. I could gather information. I could find out everything there was to know about David Clark and Brian Miller, could identify their weaknesses and their pressure points, could figure out exactly how to bring the whole house of cards crashing down without ever raising my voice or throwing a single punch. These people wanted to play games with my life and my money and my dignity, and they thought I was too simple to see what was happening. They were about to learn a very expensive lesson about underestimating the man who knows how to build things. Because the man who knows how to build things also knows exactly how to take them apart. The next morning I went to work like nothing had happened, ran my crew through a pour that went perfectly despite the heat and the humidity and the fact that two of my guys were hungover from something they had done the night before. I signed off on inspections, reviewed blueprints for the next phase, solved 3 separate problems that would have derailed us for days if I had not caught them early. And during my lunch break, while my crew was eating sandwiches in the shade and complaining about the weather, I sat in my truck with the air conditioning running and made a phone call that would change everything. Tommy Reeves answered on the second ring, his voice the same gravelly baritone I remembered from our Army days, back when we were both young and stupid and convinced that we were invincible. We had served together in the same unit for 4 years, had been through some things that neither of us liked to talk about, and when he had gotten out and gone into private investigation work, I had hired his son onto one of my crews and kept the kid out of trouble during a rough patch that could have ended with him in jail or worse. Tommy owed me for that, and more importantly, Tommy was very good at his job. I told him what I needed, keeping my voice calm and businesslike, even though my hands wanted to shake. I needed information on David Clark, his finances, his marriage, his business dealings, anything that might be useful. And I needed the same on Brian Miller, with particular attention to anything that seemed off about his money situation. I did not explain why I wanted to know, and Tommy did not ask, because that was the kind of relationship we had. He told me he would have answers within a week, maybe sooner if he got lucky, and that was that. Laura came home late that night, around 11, smelling like hotel soap and expensive cologne that was not mine, and she looked satisfied in a way that made my stomach turn even though I kept my face completely neutral. She seemed confused by my calm, kept glancing at me like she was waiting for the explosion that never came, probably wondering if I suspected anything or if I was really as oblivious as she thought. Eventually she went upstairs without saying anything at all, and I heard the shower running for a long time, washing away whatever evidence she thought she needed to hide. I slept in the guest room that night, told her I was restless and did not want to keep her awake with my tossing and turning, and she accepted that explanation without question because it fit her image of me as the simple, uncomplicated husband who never looked too closely at anything. She probably thought I was doing her a favor, giving her space after her romantic evening, and I let her think that because every assumption she made about my stupidity was another advantage I could use later. 3 days later, Tommy called me with his report, and I drove out to a diner on the highway to meet him in person, because some things you do not discuss on phones that might be monitored, even if you are being paranoid about it. The diner was the kind of place that used to be everywhere in Texas and is slowly disappearing now, with vinyl booths that squeaked when you sat down and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner since the Carter administration. Tommy was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a manila envelope on the table in front of him and a cup of that terrible coffee in his hand. He slid the envelope across the table without preamble, and I opened it and started reading while he watched me with the kind of patience that comes from years of delivering bad news to people who do not want to hear it. Inside, I found everything I needed to understand who I was really dealing with, and the picture that emerged was even more useful than I had hoped. David Clark, it turned out, was living a life built entirely on his wife's money and her family's connections. His wife, Sarah, was the daughter of Judge William Patterson, a name that carried serious weight in this part of Texas, the kind of judge who had been on the bench for 30 years and had connections to everyone who mattered in the state legal system. Sarah had bankrolled David's real estate business from the start, had used her family's money and influence to open doors that would have been closed to a guy from a trailer park in Oklahoma who had barely graduated from a community college. The problem was that David was not actually very good at selling real estate, despite his expensive suits and his practiced smile and his ability to make people think he was more successful than he really was. He had been hemorrhaging money for years, losing deals to competitors who actually knew what they were doing, and he had been hiding the losses through creative accounting and a line of credit that Sarah did not know about. His marriage was essentially a business arrangement at this point, one that gave him access to country clubs and golf courses and the kind of social network that a self-made man from nowhere could never have built on his own. Sarah tolerated him because she liked the idea of being married and did not want to deal with the scandal of a divorce. But Tommy's sources suggested that she had suspected his infidelity for a while now and was just waiting for the right excuse to pull the trigger. If she found out about his financial situation and his extracurricular activities at the same time, she would not just divorce him, she would destroy him, and her father would make sure that he never worked in real estate, anything else in the state of Texas again. Brian Miller was a different kind of mess entirely, one that I had not expected, but that made a certain kind of sense once I thought about it. He had a gambling problem, one that had started small with sports betting and weekend poker games, and had escalated over the years into something that consumed most of his waking hours and all of his disposable income. He owed money to bookies, had maxed out credit cards that his wife did not know about. And most damning of all, he had started borrowing from his company's accounts to cover his losses. Small amounts at first, a few hundred here and there, that he told himself he would pay back when his luck turned. But the amounts had grown larger as his losses mounted and his desperation increased. He was in deep, deep trouble, and he did not even know it yet because he thought he was smart enough to keep all the plates spinning indefinitely. His wife Emily was the bookkeeper for a construction firm, and she was smart and careful and would absolutely notice if she ever looked closely at the finances of her husband's business. But Brian had been careful too, compartmentalizing his life into neat little boxes, keeping his gambling separate from his home life and his affair with Laura separate from both. He thought he was juggling everything perfectly, maintaining all his secrets with the skill of a practiced liar. But I could see from Tommy's report that the balls were starting to wobble in the air. The embezzlement was getting harder to hide, the debts were getting harder to service, and one good push would send the whole thing crashing down around his ears. I thanked Tommy and paid him double what we had agreed on, because good work deserves good pay, and because I wanted him to know that I appreciated his discretion. He took the money without comment, gave me a nod that communicated something between solidarity and sympathy, and then I drove home with that envelope sitting on the passenger seat like a loaded weapon waiting to be fired. The plan was forming in my mind now, not a revenge fantasy, but an actual operational strategy. The kind of thing you put together when you are building something complicated and you need every piece to fit exactly right. I was not going to confront anyone, not going to make accusations or demands or threats. I was going to let these people destroy themselves, and all I had to do was give them the opportunity to do what they were already inclined to do anyway. The first move was subtle, almost invisible. I sent an anonymous envelope to Sarah Clark, mailed from a post office in a different county with no return address and no note inside, just printouts of her husband's credit card statements showing charges at restaurants she had never been to, hotels in cities where he had claimed to be visiting clients, and a jewelry store where he had definitely not bought anything for her. I did not include any names or photographs, did not make any accusations or suggestions, just presented the raw data and let her draw her own conclusions. A woman like Sarah, raised in a family of lawyers and judges, educated in the art of evidence and inference, would know exactly how to investigate further. I was just opening a door and letting her decide whether to walk through it. The second move was even simpler, almost elegant in its economy. I sent an anonymous tip to Emily Miller, just a few lines typed on a piece of plain paper suggesting that she might want to take a close look at the accounts receivable ledger for her husband's business, particularly the entries from the past 18 months. I did not explain why, did not provide any evidence or make any specific claims, just planted a seed of doubt in soil that was already fertile with the suspicions that any smart bookkeeper would have about a spouse who was always vague about the details of his work. Emily was a numbers person, and numbers people cannot resist a puzzle once you put it in front of them. She would dig into those books, and when she did, she would find the truth that Brian had been hiding, and she would react the way any intelligent woman would react when she discovered that her husband had been stealing from his own company to fund his gambling habit and his girlfriend. And then I waited, because the best part of any plan is watching it unfold without having to lift another finger. It took about 10 days for everything to start falling apart, and when it did, it fell apart spectacularly, like a building that has been rigged for demolition, finally giving in to gravity and collapsing in on itself in a cloud of dust and chaos. Laura announced one Tuesday morning that she was going to a marketing conference in Dallas, which was, of course, a lie that she had been telling me for months now, and she packed her little overnight bag and put on a dress that was slightly less provocative than the one that had started all of this, but still clearly designed to attract attention from anyone with eyes. I wished her a safe trip, told her I hoped the conference was productive, and she looked at me with something that might have been guilt or might have been pity before she drove off to meet her lovers at a cheap motel called the Silver Creek, about 30 miles outside of town. I was not there for what happened next, but Tommy was, parked across the road in an unmarked car with a telephoto lens and a thermos of coffee, and he gave me a detailed account that I still enjoy thinking about on long evenings when I need a reason to smile. Sarah Clark arrived first around 7 in the evening, driving her father's silver Mercedes and carrying a baseball bat that she had apparently kept in her trunk for exactly this kind of occasion. She did not go to the motel room right away. She went to the parking lot where David's car was parked, a BMW that he had bought with her money and that he was probably still making payments on, and she proceeded to demolish it with the kind of methodical fury that suggested she had been thinking about this moment for a very long time. Every window was shattered, every panel was dented, and the words "lying cheat" were keyed into the hood in letters about 6 inches tall that caught the light from the motel's neon sign. Tommy said she worked on that car for a good 10 minutes, her face completely calm and focused, like she was performing a task that required precision and attention to detail. The commotion drew attention, of course. It is hard to beat a car with a baseball bat without making some noise. And David came running out of the motel room in his boxer shorts to find his wife standing over the wreckage of his BMW, with murder in her eyes and fragments of safety glass crunching under her sensible flats. The screaming match that followed was apparently audible from the highway, with Sarah laying out every detail of his financial fraud and his infidelity in language that would have made a sailor blush. She had done her homework in the 10 days since she received my anonymous envelope, had hired her own investigators and forensic accountants, and she knew everything. The hidden debts, the fake business expenses, the affair with Laura that had been going on for nearly a year. Laura tried to slip away during the chaos, emerging from the motel room in a silk robe that she must have packed for the occasion and attempting to make it to her car without being noticed. But Sarah spotted her and redirected her rage with impressive speed, calling my wife things that I will not repeat here, but that were probably accurate given the circumstances. Tommy said Laura just stood there taking it, her face pale and her hands shaking, like a deer caught in headlights that had suddenly realized the truck was not going to stop. But the real entertainment arrived about 15 minutes later, in the form of 2 sheriff's deputies who had been dispatched on an anonymous tip about a disturbance at the motel. They found the scene already in chaos: a destroyed BMW, a screaming woman with a baseball bat, a man in his underwear trying to calm her down, and my wife standing in the parking lot in a silk robe, looking like she wished the ground would open up and swallow her whole. But the deputies were not there for the domestic dispute, entertaining as it might have been. They were there because Emily Miller had done exactly what I expected her to do, and she had found exactly what I expected her to find. Emily had spent a week going through her husband's books with the kind of attention to detail that only a professional accountant can bring to bear, and what she had discovered had made her sick to her stomach. The embezzlement was extensive, nearly $200,000 over the past 18 months. All of it used to cover gambling debts and fund his lifestyle with Laura. Emily had called the county prosecutor's office that very morning, with evidence that her husband had been embezzling from his own company for years, and she had explicitly stated that she wanted charges filed immediately because she was not going to be held responsible for his crimes when the whole thing came crashing down. The prosecutor, sensing an easy case and good publicity, had sent the deputies to pick Brian up that same evening. They found him in the room next door to David's, hiding in the bathroom and frantically trying to delete files from his phone, and they arrested him on the spot for wire fraud and misappropriation of funds. He came out in handcuffs, his face a mask of terror and disbelief, and he walked right past Laura without even looking at her because he had much bigger problems to worry about than a woman he had been sleeping with. Laura was not arrested, She had not actually committed any crimes, just broken her wedding vows in spectacular fashion, but she was standing in the parking lot of a cheap motel in a silk robe with no makeup and messy hair, surrounded by screaming spouses and flashing police lights and the wreckage of two different marriages. And Tommy told me that the look on her face was the look of someone who has just realized that the ground beneath her feet is not nearly as solid as she thought it was. She had come to this place expecting a romantic evening, expecting to continue her little game of playing multiple men against each other, while extracting as much money and attention as she could get, and instead she had walked into an ambush that she never saw coming. Tommy took photographs of the whole thing, dozens of images that captured every moment of humiliation. Sarah swinging her bat at the BMW, David pleading with his wife in his underwear, Brian being led away in handcuffs, and Laura standing alone in the middle of it all, looking lost and small and utterly defeated. He delivered them to me the next morning with a grin that suggested he had enjoyed his work more than was strictly professional, and I paid him another bonus because the entertainment value alone was worth it. The aftermath played out over the next few weeks with a kind of inevitable momentum, like watching dominoes fall in a pattern you designed yourself. Sarah Clark filed for divorce the day after the motel incident, and she did not do it quietly. She did it through her father's law firm, with a public statement that made the local papers and ensured that everyone in Graywood and the surrounding counties knew exactly why she was leaving her husband. The statement was devastating, a point-by-point accounting of David's failures as a businessman and a husband, and it made clear that Sarah considered herself the victim of a long-running con perpetrated by a man she had foolishly trusted with her family's money and her own heart. David's real estate license was suspended pending an investigation into some irregularities that the state board had suddenly become very interested in, and the word around town was that Judge Patterson had made a few phone calls to ensure that his former son-in-law would never sell another house in Texas as long as he lived. David tried to show up at the county fair about a week later, probably hoping to save face by acting like nothing had happened, but the reception he got was brutal. People turned their backs when they saw him coming. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when he approached, and eventually Sarah appeared, looking immaculate in a summer dress and a smile that did not reach her eyes, and announced to anyone within earshot that David was currently sleeping in his car because she had changed all the locks and frozen all the accounts, and the only money he had was whatever he had managed to hide in his wallet. He left town a few days later, and as far as I know, he never came back. Someone told me they saw him working at a car dealership in New Mexico a few months later, selling used sedans to people who did not know his history, and I found that oddly fitting. A man who had spent years pretending to be more successful than he was, now reduced to the kind of job he had always thought was beneath him. Brian's situation was even worse, because embezzlement charges do not just go away when you look pathetic enough. Emily cooperated fully with the prosecutor's office, providing documentation that proved she had no knowledge of her husband's crimes and that she had been the one to discover and report the fraud. In exchange, they focused all their attention on Brian himself, building a case that would ensure he spent years in prison for what he had done. He was looking at serious time, and his lawyer had already started making noises about a plea deal that would involve admitting to everything in open court and accepting whatever sentence the judge deemed appropriate. Emily took their kids and moved in with her mother in Houston, filing for divorce from behind the safety of a new address that Brian was not allowed to know. She was rebuilding her life, starting over without the man who had lied to her and stolen from his own company and spent their money on another woman. And I heard through the grapevine that she was doing well, that she had found a new job and was slowly putting the pieces back together. And Laura? Laura came home that night from the motel looking like she had aged 10 years in the span of a few hours, her makeup smeared and her hair a mess and her eyes red from crying that had clearly been going on for hours. She stormed into the house ready for a fight, ready to scream at me about how I had somehow orchestrated this disaster, ready to blame me for the choices she had made all by herself. "You did this," she hissed at me, her voice shaking with rage and fear, and something else that might have been disbelief. "You knew about everything. You planned this whole thing. You set us up." I was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water and a folder full of documents, and I did not give her the satisfaction of a dramatic confrontation. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, had rehearsed what I would say and how I would say it, and I was not about to let her provoke me into losing my composure. "I did not make you do anything, Laura," I said, and my voice was steady and even, completely devoid of the anger she was probably hoping to see. "I did not make you put on that dress. I did not make you lie to me for months. I did not make you plan with your boyfriends to steal my money and leave me with nothing. All I did was turn on the lights, and everyone saw what was crawling around in the dark." I pushed the folder across the table toward her, watching her face change as she realized what it contained. Inside were the divorce papers, already prepared by my attorney and ready for her signature, along with copies of the evidence I had gathered, the messages from her tablet, the financial records that Tommy had dug up, the photographs from the motel. I had laid it all out in black and white, irrefutable proof that she had engaged in adultery and had conspired with her lovers to defraud me of my assets in the divorce. "You can sign these papers and walk away with what you brought into this marriage, which was not much," I told her. "Or you can fight me in court, and I will make sure that every single one of those messages gets entered into evidence. I will make sure that everyone in this town knows exactly what you were planning, exactly how you talked about me behind my back, exactly how much contempt you had for the man who paid your bills and supported your hobbies and put up with your constant complaints for 15 years. I will make sure that no marketing firm in the state will ever hire you again, because who wants to trust their brand to a woman who was caught half naked in a motel parking lot while her two boyfriends got arrested and divorced around her?" She stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. And maybe she was. Maybe she had spent so many years looking at me and seeing only what she expected to see. The simple contractor, the predictable husband, the man who would never look too closely at anything, that she had forgotten to consider who I actually was. I had built my business from nothing, had survived the recession of 2008 by being smarter and tougher than my competitors, had earned the respect of every banker and inspector and supplier in the county through years of delivering exactly what I promised. Did she really think that a man who could do all that was too stupid to notice when his wife was cheating on him? She tried to argue, of course. She cried and she begged and she threatened, cycling through every tactic in her repertoire like she was working through a checklist. She told me she was sorry, that it had been a mistake, that she had been lonely and looking for attention and had fallen in with the wrong people. She told me she still loved me, that we could work through this together, that marriage counseling could help us rebuild what we had lost. When that did not work, she got angry, accused me of being controlling and manipulative, said that my coldness was the reason she had looked elsewhere in the first place. When that did not work either, she threatened to go to the police, to tell them that I had somehow committed a crime by exposing her affair, to make my life as difficult as possible. But none of it worked on me anymore. I had seen behind the mask, had read the things she wrote about me when she thought I would never know, and there was nothing she could say that would make me forget that contempt. The woman standing in front of me was not the woman I had married, or maybe she was, and I had just been too blind to see it until now. Either way, she was no longer my problem. She signed the papers 2 days later, sitting in my attorney's office with her own attorney beside her, and a look on her face like someone attending their own funeral. She tried one more time to negotiate, to get more than the nothing she was entitled to, but my attorney laid out the evidence we had and explained in very clear terms what would happen if this went to court. Her attorney, who was clearly not happy about the situation, advised her to sign and get out while she still had any dignity left. By the end of the month she was gone, her closet empty and her bathroom cleared out, and her presence in my life erased like she had never been there at all. She took a bus to somewhere in Oklahoma, where she had a cousin who was apparently willing to take her in, and I heard through the grapevine that she was working at a department store and living in a small apartment that was nothing like the house she had been so proud of. It was not the life she had imagined for herself, but it was the life she had earned. The town of Graywood is small enough that everyone knows everyone else's business, and the story of what happened at the Silver Creek Motel spread through the community like wildfire through dry brush. I never talked about it myself, never explained or justified or gloated about what I had done, but people put the pieces together on their own. They saw how calm I had been through the whole thing, how I had kept going to work and running my crews and living my life, while three other lives collapsed in spectacular fashion around me. They saw the divorce papers get filed, saw Laura leave town with nothing but a suitcase and a bus ticket, saw David and Brian face the consequences of their choices in courts, both legal and social. And they understood, without anyone having to say it out loud, that I had known exactly what was happening and had handled it in exactly the way I wanted to handle it. I got a lot of handshakes at the coffee shop that month. A lot of nods from men who had maybe gone through something similar and wished they had kept their heads the way I kept mine. A few women approached me too, some with sympathy in their eyes and some with something else entirely, but I was not ready for any of that yet. I was still processing, still coming to terms with the fact that the life I thought I had been building for 15 years had been a fiction, a stage set constructed by a woman who saw me as nothing more than a convenient source of income and stability. 3 weeks after Laura left, there was a thunderstorm, one of those massive Texas systems that rolls in from the west and turns the whole sky green before it opens up and drowns everything in sight. The rain came down in sheets so thick you could barely see 10 feet in front of you, and the thunder was so loud it shook the windows in their frames. I was home alone, eating leftover pizza and watching the lightning crack across the sky when I heard someone knocking at the front door. The kind of knocking that sounds desperate, urgent, like whoever is on the other side needs to get in right now before something terrible happens. I opened the door and there was Laura, soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her face and her clothes sticking to her body, looking like something that had been dragged out of a flood and left on my doorstep. She had lost weight since I had seen her last, and her eyes had a hollow look that suggested she had not been sleeping well. Behind her, the rain came down in sheets so thick I could barely see the street. "Michael," she said, and her voice was barely audible over the thunder. "Please, I have nowhere else to go. My credit cards are all maxed out. My family will not talk to me anymore. The cousin I was staying with kicked me out because she said I was bringing bad energy into her house." She was shivering, whether from the cold or from something else I could not tell. I made a terrible mistake, and I know that now. I was stupid and selfish, and I threw away the best thing I ever had. "Please, can we try again? I will do anything. I love you." I looked at her standing there on my porch, this woman who had shared my bed and my home and my life for 15 years, and I tried to feel something, anger, satisfaction, pity, anything at all. But there was nothing there except a kind of tired clarity, the feeling you get when you finish a long project and look back at all the work you did and realize it is finally done. "You do not love me, Laura," I said, and my voice was not cruel, just honest in a way that I had not been able to be while we were still married. "You never did. You loved the life I could give you, the security and the comfort and the freedom to do whatever you wanted while I paid the bills and stayed out of your way. And when that was not enough anymore, you started looking for something more exciting, and you did not care who got hurt in the process." I shook my head slowly, watching the rain bounce off the porch railing behind her. "I was never a person to you. I was a tool, something useful to have around. And now that you have nowhere else to turn, you want to pick it back up again because you do not have any other options." "That is not true," she said, but her voice cracked on the words, and we both knew she was lying. "I am not in the business of rescuing people who jumped off a cliff on purpose," I told her. "You made your choices, Laura. Now you get to live with them." I stepped back into the doorway, my hand on the edge of the door. "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, but you are not going to find it here." And I closed the door, and the sound of the lock clicking into place was the last thing I ever said to her. I stood there for a minute, listening to the muffled sound of her crying on the other side, and then I walked back to the living room and finished my pizza while the storm raged outside. She was gone by the time the rain stopped, and I never saw her again. A month passed, and then 2, and the world kept turning the way it always does. Laura got on a bus to somewhere else. I never found out exactly where, and Graywood absorbed the scandal and moved on to the next piece of gossip the way small towns always do. David Clark was last seen working at a car dealership somewhere in New Mexico, his real estate dreams crushed beyond repair. Brian Miller took a plea deal and got 18 months in a minimum security facility, and Emily served him with divorce papers before his sentencing hearing was even over. As for me, I am still here, still building things, still running my crews and winning contracts and doing the work I have always done. Business has actually been better since everything happened, because people in this town respect a man who keeps his head when everything around him is falling apart. They know that if I can handle a disaster in my personal life with that kind of composure, I can probably handle a disaster on a job site too. It is not the kind of advertising you can buy, but it works better than any billboard. I am standing on the roof of a new shopping center we just finished, watching the sun go down over the Texas plains, and the sky is turning colors that would look fake if you painted them. Orange and pink and deep red at the edges, like the whole horizon is on fire. My phone buzzes in my pocket, a text from a potential client about a new project, another opportunity to build something that will last. I breathe in the warm air and I think about everything that happened, all the betrayal and the planning and the slow collapse of 3 lives that intersected with mine in the worst possible way. A lot of people think revenge is supposed to be loud. They think it is about confrontation and violence, about making your enemies see your face and know your name when you bring them down. But they are wrong about that. Real revenge is quieter than that, more patient. Real revenge is setting up the dominoes and stepping back and letting gravity do the work. Real revenge is standing on a rooftop at sunset, looking out at a world that you built with your own hands, while the people who tried to tear you down have turned into dust and blown away on the wind. The phone buzzes again, and I pull it out to read the message. New contract, good money, interesting project. Life goes on, and so do I. This is what freedom feels like. Not the absence of pain, because the pain is still there somewhere, buried deep where I do not have to look at it, but freedom from the weight of it, freedom from the need to react and engage with people who do not deserve my energy. They wanted to break me, and instead they broke themselves, and I did not even have to raise my voice. The sun dips below the horizon, and the first stars start to appear in the darkening sky. I take one more breath of the warm Texas air, and then I climb down from the roof and get in my truck and drive home. Tomorrow there will be more work to do, more things to build, more problems to solve. But tonight, just for a few hours, I'm going to sit on my porch and drink a cold beer and enjoy the silence.